My very special guest was a CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and other tech companies. She was a faculty member at Apple University, and before that led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick teams at Google. Of course, I am speaking about the one and only Kim Scott, author of Radical Respect and Radical Candor, and co-host of the Radical Candor podcast. Welcome to the show, Kim.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited for our conversation.
I am too. I'm delighted to be able to chat with you. I loved Radical Candor and have more recently loved Radical Respect. So I'm looking forward to diving into them today.
Excellent.
Well, I'll start with Radical Candor. I'll be honest with you, Kim, I don't remember exactly when I read it, but I know that you taught us that it's important to care personally and to challenge directly when offering feedback or guidance. But the book came out in 2017, and I know a lot has changed since then when you think about Gen Z, you think about remote and hybrid work, post-pandemic, et cetera. So I just wanted to get your take on whether Radical Candor, is it more prevalent than it was when you first brought it to the world, or is it challenged in some ways based on what we've started to see lately?
You know, it's so interesting. It keeps growing and keeps going into new places. It's been really exciting. I think when you publish a book, sometimes it's like sending a child off to college, and this one, Radical Candor continues to find its way into new places. So that's been really, really fun. I mean, I think the thing that hasn't changed is that all organizations, whether it's a company or a nonprofit, they're full of people. They're full of people trying to accomplish something. And so I think a lot of it is sort of pretty evergreen. Of course, there are tweaks that we had to make during the pandemic when we were almost all of us, so many of us were remote. And now a lot of us are still remote. Every new generation is a little different, but the one thing that is always true is that it is the job of the younger generation to tell the older generation how we've screwed up. And that was true, 1,000 years ago, and it's still true today. And I expect it will be true in another 1,000 years.
Yeah, and I think it gives a relevance to your book, obviously. And if anything, they've turned up the volume. They've really amplified the principles that you shared with us back then. And now you've built on that with Radical Respect, which I very much love. And it's actually a prequel in many ways. I've seen it, you describe it that way, which is amazing. And I think that like Radical Candor, you have these two axes that really paint this quadrant that we really want to be in the most. And in Radical Respect, you have two new axes. And so I wanted to talk about them just to kind of frame for people who might not be familiar with your work. The first one is this coerce versus collaborate.
Yeah.
And so as leaders, we always have a decision to make where we want to fall on this kind of a spectrum. What can you tell me about coerce versus collaborate?
Well, I hope that everyone listening wants to optimize for collaboration, not coercion, because it's pretty clear that coercion does not get the best out of people. There's the newest Nobel Prize winner in economics wrote a book, How Nations Fail, about how the problem with coercion and how it just doesn't work in terms of building an economy or building a company. But like we as human beings, our superpower is collaboration. And when we try to tell people what to do or force them to do something, then we lose the benefit of collaboration and we don't get great results.
Makes good sense. I do see troubling headlines still to this day, though, especially around things like return to office. I see the strikes that are happening. So I don't know that everyone got your message, though, Kim.
Yeah, well, it's so tempting when you have power to hang on to it. Like that is also a very old human instinct and a dangerous one. I think that I wrote an op-ed recently in the New York Times about how important it is to be willing to let go of that power, to submit to checks and balances, both in your company, but also more broadly in a society.
Yeah, I agree. I have a saying that a powerful fist has a hard time letting go. And
yes. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's true. But I'll move us to the second one, which is the second axis, which is demand conformity versus honor individuality.
Yes.
So again, we're kind of fighting human nature, perhaps in some ways here. But what can you tell me about the difference between conformity versus honoring
Yeah.
individuality.
Yeah. I mean, yes. Yeah. Yes, we're fighting it. And yes, I think most people recognize that they want to honor individuality and that they expect their own individuality to be honored. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never met a single person who said, what I really want to build is a dystopic 1984 style. Everybody's marching in lockstep and wearing the same clothes. Like we know that doesn't work very well, I think, at some level. And yet it's so tempting to begin to demand conformity without even realizing what we're doing. So what I'm trying to capture with this 2x2 is that radical respect is what most of us intend to build. And it's the kind of work environment where I mean, there are tyrannical individuals out there in the world, but they're pretty few. They're very noisy, but there's not that many of them, thank heavens. And so what possibly gets in the way? And before we talk about what gets in the way of radical respect, I want to kind of double click on the word respect, because there are two very different meanings of respect. One is something I have to earn. I have to earn your respect for me as a writer by writing a good book. But I'm not talking about the kind of respect that we have to earn. I'm talking about the other definition of respect, which is the kind of unconditional regard that we owe each other for our shared humanity. And it's that kind of unconditional respect that I'm talking about with radical respect.
Yeah, it's much more universal. Everybody gets to participate in that type of respect.
Yeah. We do. Nobody has to earn my regard for them as a human being. Like, that's something I owe them. Right.
I love that so much. And it's so true. I think a lot of times when we feel like we're not getting respect, we're like, you need to respect me. It's like, hold on a second. That's the wrong kind of respect that we're fighting so hard for.
Yeah.
But the other people saying, I want to be shown respect, when I show up at work. And maybe you mentioned this 1,000-year-old plus, every new generation that enters feels a little disrespected. But then at the other extreme, the oldest generations, they feel disrespected too.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And I think the answer, at least for me, is, and I don't know how it happened. Like, I went from being the youngest to the oldest in 1 week. But anyway,
what a week that was.
Yeah, what a week. Such a long week. But what I have found is that the way that I earn the right to share whatever wisdom I've gotten by having had more years on the planet than the young people who I work with, or the young people who I live with, teenagers at home, is by soliciting feedback from them, by really rewarding their candor when they give it to me, because I'm going to get it, whether I want it or not. And the more open I can be to feedback from younger people, it's a great way to stay young. B, it's a great way to learn new things and build great relationships. And also, if I want to share my thoughts, I can't feel like they're disrespecting me because they're sharing their thoughts with me.
I know in my own personal journey, when millennials entered the workforce, I was still pretty self-absorbed at that time. I just didn't really notice whatever differences there might have been. But I've taken a real curiosity in Gen Z and even Gen Alpha, and I'm just delighted by what I'm learning.
Fun.
So, it's easy to provide respect when you come from that universal place that you just shared with us. So
exactly,
appreciate that. And then I think that, as you mentioned, there are some hindrances. There are some things that do get in the way of radical respect. And your book really provides this sort of guidebook about how to approach these hindrances, but even from different situations, and which I really love. But I'll keep it pretty straightforward for the listeners who are kind of dialing in today. And I want to start with this first set of 3 hindrances that you really described, and maybe you can define for us, just so we're clear moving forward, when it comes to bias, prejudice, and bullying. What's the difference between those 3?
Yeah, so there's a million things that get in the way of radical respect, but bias, prejudice, and bullying are the big 3 in my experience. And I think one of the problems when we use these words is that we often conflate them as though they're the same thing. And then the problem feels monolithic and insoluble. But as leaders of businesses, we're problem solvers. So let's break the problem down into its component parts so we can solve it. In order to do that, I want to offer some super simple definitions. Bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it. I'm really talking about unconscious bias. Whereas prejudice is meaning it. Prejudice is a very consciously held belief. usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype, but it's something people really believe. Whereas bullying is not really about a belief, conscious or unconscious. It's about being mean. So bias, not meaning it, prejudice, meaning it, bullying, being mean. And sometimes, when we're in the heat of the moment and something happens, like I bet everyone listening has had a moment in a meeting in the last week where somebody said or did something that made you cringe, but you didn't know what to say. So you kind of crawled under the table. And I think that having these simple definitions can help us untangle those moments and respond in a way that leaves us feeling a little more optimistic.
Yeah, it's a lot of times you feel a reaction to something, but you've never really thought in your mind about the difference between those three things.
Yeah.
And I love that you've really laid out pretty clear, very clear definitions as to helping us understand, like, oh, wait, what flavor of this impingement am I really experiencing right now? They're not all the same, right?
Yeah. They're not all the same. And of course, there's not like bright lines between. Sometimes bias bleeds into prejudice, bleeds into bullying, and sometimes like it's not totally clear. But even when I'm not sure what's going on, it's useful for me to say, what do I think it is? And that can, because these moments often come charged with a lot of emotion. And having a simple sort of analytical framework to say, I think what's going on here is bias. And so now I know what to do next.
Well, all the more reason that I love your book, because not only in the emotional heat of the moment, we need simple recognition or simple sort of a categorization, if you will, but we also need a simple response. And so you give us very specific different responses that you recommend for those different situations. I thought we could pull those apart a little bit. In the case of bias, that first one where somebody doesn't necessarily mean it, but they've said something that's, certainly not okay, you recommend using what you call an I statement. Can you give me an example of how that works and what an I statement is?
Sure, absolutely. An I statement just sort of holds up a mirror. It sort of explains to the person, here's what I'm noticing in this situation. I'm also curious what you're noticing. So for example, a colleague of mine went into a meeting with this woman who he worked with and one other guy. And they were a small company and they were meeting with a big company. So they walked into this giant conference room at the big company. And the woman on the team had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. So she sat in the center of the table. This guy sat to her left and the other guy sat to his left. And when the other side came in, the first person sat across from the guy to the woman's left. The next person sat across from the other guy. And then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling by herself. And you're kind of grinning. You've noticed.
I'm cringing. Yeah. I just can't see this coming. Yep.
It happens. It happens all the time. So she started talking. She was undeterred. She started talking. And when the other side had questions about what she was saying, they didn't ask her. They asked her two colleagues who are men. You've noticed this happen before as well. I can tell from your reaction. And so it happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time. And finally, he stood up and he said, I think we should switch seats. And they did. And that was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. So he was being a great upstander in the moment. Nice. And why did he do that? Partly he did that because he just wanted to win the deal. There's a practical side to disrupting bias. But he also did it because he liked his colleague and it bothered him to see her get ignored. It wasn't that he thought she couldn't stand up for herself, but he realized that in compassion for the people who were saying or doing the biased thing, that it was going to be easier for them to hear it from him than from her. And so it was compassion for her, but also compassion for the people. And I think this is something we often skip over is we want to condemn the person who said or did the bias thing, but he felt for them because he knew that he had done it. And I feel for them too. Like I maybe haven't had that particular bias, but I have other biases that it's embarrassing, And then the fourth reason he did it was because he knew that if he didn't say anything, if he didn't intervene in some way, that he was going to wake up at 3 a.m. kicking himself. You kind of, if you're a silent bystander, you kind of get slimed by somebody else's behavior. And that's that cringe moment. And nobody wants to wake up at 3 a.m. feeling like, why didn't I say something?
It's so true. And the reason I was having the reaction is because I'm certain I've been that person at more times than I probably care to think about. But at the same time, a lot of what can happen is you don't respond in the moment because you just don't know how. You don't know what
Yes.
to say. You don't know how to be that
Yeah.
upstander. And this is where I think your example of here's an I statement. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, that I could do. Now I can remember to do that in the moment.
Yeah, and you may not know what's going to come out of your mouth next. Start with the word I, and then
Go from there.
Yeah, partly this is kind of like a momentum game, and you want to just jump in and start. So that's if you think it's bias. But if you think it's prejudice, an I response is not going to work.
Right.
Because if an I response kind of holds the mirror up for the other person, and what's going on is not bias but rather prejudice, that person is going to grin in that mirror. Aren't I good looking? They're going to like what they see.
Speaking my language.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of how this worked for me at one point. I had been out for 5 months on maternity leave, and I had just come back to the office, and I had twins, so this is my second day back in the office. And for people who've been out on parental leave and come back, like, there's a lot of feelings in those first days when you come back. So I was having all those feelings, and I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children," which of course at that moment was like him punching me in the stomach. It's like a hard thing. But I thought this was unconscious bias. I didn't think he meant it quite the way it sounded. So I tried an I statement. I said, "Oh, I decided to show up at work today because I thought it'd be a great idea to neglect my children." And I was expecting him to have your response, to laugh and apologize. We'd move on. But no, he doubles down. He's like, "Oh no, Kim, you don't understand. It is really bad that you're working. I've got some research I'm going to send you."
Oh.
And so now I know this is not unconscious bias. This is a very consciously held prejudice that he has. And so now I need an it statement. An it statement kind of draws a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose those beliefs on you. And an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to a company policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So I opted for company policy first. And I said, "It is an HR violation for you to tell me I'm neglecting my children by showing up at work today." And that had the desired impact. He kind of backed off. But I didn't want to escalate this. And so I said, now I'm going to try another it statement, but this time I'm going to appeal to common sense. I said, "I'm not going to escalate this to HR, but we can agree it is my decision, together with my partner, how we raise our children, just as it is your decision, together with your wife, how you raise your children." And he kind of grudgingly, but so I knew I needed to take a third crack at this. So I'm going to use another it response that appeals to common sense again. And I said, "Furthermore, it's my guess that you don't want to read my research any more than I want to read your research." And then he kind of laughed, and we moved on, and we were able to work together better. And I think for me, it was really important. If I hadn't said anything, we would not have worked. I would have been so resentful of him and mistrustful of him, and been afraid that he was trying to prevent me from taking on work that was going to require me to travel, since if I shouldn't be working, I definitely shouldn't be, all that kind of stuff. So I think that for me, at least in that moment, it was important to respond.
I love how the it statement sort of it depersonalizes it in a sense. It makes it about the issue or about the difference of opinion, as opposed to the I statement, which was very much about a different type of get your attention.
Yeah. I mean, the I statement, you make yourself a little bit vulnerable with an I statement. And in the case of someone's prejudice, they don't really care how you feel. They think they're right.
Right.
And, there are going to be times where maybe you want to argue with somebody's prejudice, but this was not one of those. I didn't really care. Thank goodness he and I were not raising children together. Like, it didn't matter what his,
Yeah,
we were
that'd be a
trying
longer
to,
conversation.
yeah, we were selling ads,
Right, right.
you know, and it really didn't matter to our, we could collaborate well without agreeing about how the best way to raise children.
I
So,
found the stories that you include throughout the book, I found so helpful because they really provide these great illustrations, and they also show these cringeworthy moments that we know happen in
yeah,
organizations all too often.
every day, all day long.
Every doggone day still. It's unbelievable. And,
Yeah,
when people aren't at their best, and I know now with economic headwinds and like we talked about return to office, there's so many
yeah,
different things happening. People are not going to be
yeah,
at their best. But
yeah.
one thing that absolutely does happen today is bullying in the workplace.
Yes,
We don't like
yeah,
to talk about it, but it's true.
yeah,
And when it does happen, now you suggest a you statement. Can you tell us
yes.
about a you statement?
Yeah. So the reason why an it statement won't work in the face of bullying is that when someone is in, and I don't want to label people as bullies because I have bullied others too. I mean, but I'm not a bully. But when people are in this mindset that they're trying to bully you, if you show them where a boundary is, they're going to kick right past it.
Mm,
And you also, I think, when somebody is trying to bully you, you don't want to use an I statement. You don't want to bring them closer. What you really want to do is you want to push them away. And I learned this from when my my kids were little. Both my son and my daughter were getting bullied, and they were in third grade. They're twins. And I remember sort of talking with my editor. I was in the middle of writing Radical Respect, and I was like, "What do I tell them to like?" And I started out making the wrong suggestion. And this is how I learned. I started out recommending an I statement. And I think there's a mistake a lot of parents make and a lot of, frankly, people in general make. And I said, well, tell these kids, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. That's the,
mm,
and they bang their fist on the table, big eye roll, mom. They are trying to make us feel sad. Why would we tell them they succeeded? I'm like, oh,
mm,
that's a really good point. Like, don't use an I statement when you're
mm.
confronting bullying. Instead, try a you response. Like, you can't talk to me like that. Or even a you question. What's going on for you here? Why are you behaving this way? And if those two things feel uncomfortable or feel like, you may not be able to back up the statement, you can't talk to me like that, just try a you non sequitur. Where'd you get that shirt? And the idea here is that you're not accepting whatever it is this person who's bullying you has dished out. You're not accepting it. You're not even engaging with it. You're just asking them to respond to you on some totally other topic.
Mm.
And, again, this is not going to solve all the world's problems, but there was a person who was giving advice to people who were going to conferences. And for a while this was happening. I wonder if this still happens, but for a while, organizations trying to save money when they sent employees to conferences would ask them to share hotel rooms. And
Sure.
invariably, some guy would come up and suggest that he be my roommate. I was like, no, but not even engaging with that. But where'd you get that shirt? It was a helpful response because it can be kind of a tense moment.
Yeah, and I think this is where you're putting into our toolkit things that we can remember in those moments of emotional sort of high temperature, right? So
Yeah.
one of the ones I saw in the book, too, you can't talk to me like that.
Yeah.
What wham? It's like, whoa, that's going to get somebody's attention. Like
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
a you statement that will stop somebody in their track. Again, not going to solve all the world's problems and work in every case, but
Yeah.
you certainly make your point pretty quickly, and that's one we can all remember.
Yes, yeah. And just start with the word you, and then figure
Really.
out what to do next. I like you can't talk to me like that, and you probably like it too. But I think you and I are both probably have more privilege than everyone in the world does. There are a lot of
Yeah.
people who've told me if I tell someone you can't talk to me like that, their response is, "Oh yes, I can," and then they double down. And
Yeah.
so I want to acknowledge that that's not going to work equally well for everyone, and that's like
Yeah.
a big part of what radical respect is all about.
I like that. And I think that, leaders who are listening to the podcast, the show's called Lead the People, clearly talking about leadership. Leaders have this special responsibility in every way, in my opinion, because we either create or we tolerate the different types of conditions that we have in our workplaces. But how would you connect those dots for me when you talk about the role of leaders and the responsibility leaders have specifically as it pertains to radical respect in organizations, Kim?
Yeah. So leaders have got to address bias, prejudice, and bullying. And they've got to not just address it, but their real job is actually to prevent it from happening. So, if you're an upstander, your job is to intervene in some way. But if you're a leader, you have a much bigger responsibility, which is to prevent it. So, I recommend a couple of sort of practical, tactical things leaders can do to prevent bias, prejudice, and bullying from getting in the way of their team's ability to do great work. What do you do about bias? Because it's so tempting to ignore it. It's awkward. It's like, I don't know. Sometimes it feels like somebody farted and you just and ignore the fart, but don't ignore the bias. So I recommend disrupting bias. And disrupting bias is not public criticism. It's sort of like a correction. Like if you have kids who play baseball, my son is a big baseball player. If he's trying to steal second base and he needs to get back, I yell back. I don't wait till after the game and say, you really should have run back. That's what bias is a pattern. And we as human beings, we're pattern makers. And we're either going to make good patterns or bad patterns. And so one of your jobs as a leader is to help your team make better patterns. And in order to do this, I think it's important to teach your team to disrupt bias in the moment, not to just ignore it. Because if you ignore it, you reflect it and reinforce it. You're ensuring that it's going to happen again. And so one of the things that I recommend is that you sit down with your team and you say, what is the word or phrase that we can use to disrupt bias in the moment? So I like to wave a purple flag, but not everybody likes it's a friendly purple flag. It's not a yellow flag, and it matches the book, Radical Respect. But not everybody likes it. I was working with another team, and what they would do is they would hold up a peace sign. Another team I worked with would say, if you notice somebody saying something biased, you would say, ouch, giving the person who said the biased thing the opportunity to say, oops, I'm sorry. There's another team I worked with that had kind of a cat theme, and they would meow at each other, whatever it is. Like, don't try to be the word police or the word dictator as a leader. You want to ask your team, like, what are you all going to actually say or do? So that's number one, is coming up with a shared vocabulary with your team. The step number two is to teach because we all have biases. There's not a human being on the planet who's bias free. And so we're all going to be on the giving, but also the receiving end of the bias disruption. So teaching people how to manage the natural shame that they're going to feel, because we want to take shame out of the game, but there's no magic word that will, like, if you tell me I've said or done something biased, I'm going to feel ashamed no matter how well you put it. And so I need to learn how to manage through the shame myself. And so work with your team to learn how to say, thank you for pointing it out. Just like take a deep breath. Thank you for pointing it out. And then either I get it and I'll work on not doing it again, or I don't get it. Can we talk after the meeting? And the I don't get it thing is really hard to say, because now I'm doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I've hurt someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't know what I did wrong. But everyone is going to be in that situation. And so helping to normalize that and teach people how to move through those uncomfortable moments so that they can learn, so that we can learn together. And then last but not least, I think that it's really important to build stamina for this, to have a shared commitment to doing this, because you can sit down with your team and you can agree on the phrase and you can agree how to respond, and then you're not going to do it unless you really have a shared commitment. So if you get to the end of a meeting and no bias has been disrupted, like take an extra beat and say, what do we miss in this meeting? And ask people. And this has got to just become part of your team norm to prevent bias. So what do you think about that?
I think it's very actionable for leaders. And I think just like you had said, whenever you're in a situation and you're like, I don't really get what I did wrong, but everybody thinks I did something wrong. even the curiosity or the asking to try to dispel your own ignorance is still an act of kindness. If somebody's like, okay, well, at least you're coming to me after the meeting and you want to learn more about something that's obvious to me, but it's not obvious to you. I'm
Yeah.
not going to, take offense to that. I'm going to take time to honor that curiosity that you have so that we can all sort of move forward here.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely.
What really is impressed upon me, though, is we have so much of this need, as you said at the top, when it comes to collaboration. When you look at the future of business, there's so much of the technical bits are frittering away any sort of competitive advantage we might have had. It's all going to come down to how well we mobilize people and we increase our diversity, we increase innovation, we increase collaboration, cooperation outcomes. That's going to put us in close contact with one another, which means these things like bias are going to happen.
Yeah.
So you're giving us a technology almost for dealing with these human social issues that come up in a very elegant way.
Yeah, yeah. Ignoring it is not going to work. And I think it's really important to disrupt bias. It's also really important to make sure as a leader that you're creating consequences for bullying. Because if there's one thing that's going to get in the way of a team's ability to work together well, it's someone who bullies others. Yeah. And so you've got to create conversational consequences. You've got to learn how to shut it down in the moment. You've got to learn how to create compensation consequences. Don't give good ratings and high bonuses to people who bully others. They've got to feel it. And last but not least, there've got to be career consequences. Whatever you do, don't promote a bully. Right. There comes a moment in too many companies' histories when the jerks begin to win. And that's the moment when the culture begins to lose. And the results suffer not too long after that. Yeah. And so you want to give someone who bullies others feedback about why their behavior is not acceptable, why it's going to prevent them from growing in their career. And ultimately, if they can't stop the behavior, you've got to fire them. And this is hard because often this person is playing some kind of important role on the team, but I'm just going to say this once. It's better to have a hole than an asshole. So don't let those people stick around.
Yeah, that's not the tipping point you want. You want the other, you want the other kind where we all find our next gear when it comes to working together and collaborating. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Well, I know a lot of leaders that want to provide the types of outcomes that you're describing, and now with the techniques that you're giving us, they have a better shot than ever. But I also know that leaders have this wide range of ways that they like to learn from experts like yourself. Some like to listen to things like podcasts, and some like to read stuff. So I guess my question for you, Kim, when it comes to all these different ways that you're helping educate leaders everywhere about radical candor and radical respect, what are some of the different either programs, courses, just different kind of ways you have available for leaders who want to do all these great things that you're talking about with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a book, there's an audio book, there's a lit video book, and you can find all this stuff on radicalcandor.com. We also made a sitcom, a Radical Candor / Radical Respect sitcom, and you can check that out on our website. We also have a community where you can learn more about this. You can ask questions of other community members. You can also ask questions of me personally. I show up on the community. And there's also a fake Kim Scott, an AI bot that you can ask questions of. And you can practice conversations with this AI bot as well. We all hate role plays, but people have found the bot really helpful in terms of getting ready for those conversations that they know they need to have, but they're kind of dreading.
That is so cool.
And listen to our podcast, of course. So all that stuff is on radicalcandor.com.
All that great stuff. I love it. And Kim, I'm going to shift gears to have a fun trivia segment for us. You mentioned that you have a sitcom. I had read also that you were mentioned on the HBO show Silicon Valley.
Yes, yes.
I think it probably helped your book sales for sure.
It did. It was very painful, but I was happy to go through the pain because it did help book sales. And the thing about Silicon Valley is it's loves to be cynical, and the episode was supposed to be about radical candor, but really it was about obnoxious aggression, what I call obnoxious and manipulative insincerity. And I think this is a mistake that people make all the time. They think that well, this is where the drama is, and when someone's a jerk or when someone's passive aggressive or political, that's where the drama is. But those are not the mistakes that most people make most of the time. Most people, it turns out, are pretty nice people. And in my experience, the problem that I have confronted more than any other problem is what I call ruinous empathy, where somebody fails to tell me something that I'd be better off knowing because they don't want to hurt my feelings or offend me. And so learning how to not be ruinously empathetic and instead be radically candid is what radical candor is all about. But that wasn't what Silicon Valley said.
No, and I think when you see, things like Dilbert or Horrible Bosses or Office Space
Yeah.
or more recently Silicon Valley, then they really hold up just enough truth to us to recognize it, to be like, you know what, unfortunately, that's not that far off. And that's part of it. But what I did is I took inspiration from the Silicon Valley name of the show, and I'm going to have a trivia question for us, the AI generated. And here's our trivia question about Silicon Valley. And
All
it
right.
is this: Kim, what large body of water is located to the west of Silicon Valley?
The Pacific Ocean.
It's got to be the Pacific Ocean. So listeners, you can lock in your answer if you're playing along at home. And I think we're going to absolutely get this one right. That's correct. Ding, ding, ding.
Excellent.
So located west coast of the United States, bordering the Pacific Ocean. That's awesome. Well, Kim, you did a fabulous job telling us about all the great resources that you have over on radicalcandor.com. I'm going to include that link in the show notes, listeners, so you're only one click away from finding all the great stuff that Kim told us about. I know you have different ways that you like to learn. And that AI bot, I'm going to go check that out myself, because you're right. Role play is so cringy, but the chance to get my own chance to have Kim put me through the paces, I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, but you don't have to do it in front of any other person. And one of the wonderful things about AI is it doesn't judge.
It doesn't judge. How about that? Well, Kim, thanks so much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate it. Just loved having you on.
Great conversation. Thanks so much.